Geoenergy today focuses on the status of electrification in the country. And to summarize the efforts by both the line ministry and the main role players, I'm joined by Tom Alwendo, the Minister of Mines and Energy. Very good evening to you, sir, and thank you so much for joining us.
Good evening, Jonas, and good to see you again.
Let's get into the topic of electrification in Namibia. What is the current status?
Yeah. I think, as you have said in your introduction, electricity is very, very important for economic development. And it's not really like any other commodity that, people can decide not to have it or to consume it. I have a choice not to buy a car. I have a choice not to buy, something which I can really have an alternative. But unfortunately for electricity, it is really, very important. If you don't have electricity as a country, you cannot develop, your mining companies cannot run, all your industry cannot run without electricity. So it's very, very important. And therefore, it's something really we need to continue to pay attention to. Now, in terms of the status where we are, usually we do a thorough study of the status during the census. And the last census that was done, which was in 2011 only, the next census is about to start.
Yeah.
At that point, the access to electrification throughout the country, it was about just over 50%. That's now including rural areas and urban and semi-urban areas. It was about just over 50%. And of that, 70% of the urban areas were electrified. So it was quite a high number for urban. But as you know, in all the urban areas, not all people have got access to electricity. And at that time also, with regard to rural electrification, it was only just over 20% of rural electrification what was done. So that was the status then. But over the years since then, the government has a rural electrification program, for example, that has been going on. And therefore, we are confident that I think by the time we do the census again, I'm sure those numbers will have increased. So it's an important area that really, we keep paying attention to, yes.
Looking at the demand for energy and the forecast for economic development in the country, and as you rightfully mentioned, there will be a census that will be carried out soon. And of course, the population has grown. Do you think we can meet the demand?
We should be able to. Currently, for example, when it comes to the demand, we have got the installed capacity of about 600 megawatts of electricity. That's now the installed capacity, whether it's the solar or the wind or the Wakana that we know of, or the Anihus. That's about, it's give you about capacity of 600 megawatts. The current demand stands at 620 megawatts. So we're more or less there in terms of the installed capacity versus what we need to, what we are demanding. I think we are there. But the story doesn't also end there. Because it's one thing to have installed, you've got a plant that can give you, let's say it's installed to give you 50 megawatts. But because of the nature of the source of that energy, for example, if it's solar, it does not always give you that 50 megawatt all the time. Sometimes give you 30, sometimes it go 40. The maximum is 50. So it's one thing to have that installed capacity of 600 versus the 620 demand. We know that it does not always give you all the energy you need, and therefore we need to keep adding to the installed capacity to be able to meet the demand.
It seemed just like yesterday when Vision 2030 was launched, and believe it or not, we were only 10 years, actually less than 10 years to go before we reach the year 2030. What do you think, looking at the Harambee Prosperity Plan and Vision 2030, what needs to be done in the energy sector to ensure that those goals set within those two plans are realized?
Yeah. Now, when you say Vision 2030 was just recently, I don't know, do you remember when it was launched? Vision 2030 was launched, I think it was 93, 94. And it's true. I mean, when it was launched, probably everybody thought, 2030 is, way ahead of us, and therefore, In fact, I remember some people saying, but why do you need such a long-term vision? I mean, why can't you just tell us what you're going to do next, the year or year after that? But yes, I think Vision 2030, the year 2030 is upon us. I think you should also probably not look at the electricity part separate from the whole economic development. It's one of those economic development goes along with electricity demand. You need to have electricity to develop. You also need to have an economic sector that can demand electricity. So it's not something you can only talk about it separately. But as I said, given what we're able already to add to the installed capacity, I think we should be able to do that. In 2011, for example, the capacity that was installed was actually about below 400, and now we're at least 600. So I think we should be able to demand or to meet the demand the economy actually needs for us to be able to continue developing.
But are you happy so far with the progress? I mean, 2030 is just 10 years to go. But looking back at when it was launched and looking now, can you really say, and with pride, that yes, indeed, there is a difference when we started and to how far we've come?
I think I would be happy, but I could be happier if, for example, by 2030, we would be able to say all the electricity that we demand can be locally generated. I will be happier. And we do have a plan to actually to make sure that by 2030 that has happened. Because currently what the plan we have got is to add another 220 megawatts to the 600, and therefore that certainly should be able to meet all our demands. So I will be definitely much happier by the 2020. I'm quite happy and certain that we should be able to actually meet all our demands by 2030.
When you look at Namibia's current, let's talk a little bit about Namibia's current policy on energy generation.
We do have a long-term development policy for electricity generation, what we call integrated resource development plan. That tells, it's actually a 20-year plan that says, in the next 20 years, this is what we are going to do in terms of developing the energy sector. And that plan talks about where we are going to get what will be the source of electricity. For example, we have introduced solar, we have introduced wind to add to the hydro that we've been actually relying on. So that plan is what we are following. And therefore, in terms of that plan, we should be able then to reach the goals that were set for Vision 2030. So currently, we are also busy reviewing that plan because it was really introduced more than 5 years ago. So, and the idea was that every 5 years, you need to review that plan because number one, as we know, technology changes very, very fast and keep, evolving, and therefore you cannot only just to say, okay, I got a 20-year plan, therefore I'm just going to follow it, willy-nilly. You need to make sure at least that you're still following the trend, how the sector is evolving. So right now we are busy with the review of the plan, just to make sure that we are still really current, we are still following what is possible, because some of the technology that we might have thought will be possible going forward may have actually become obsolete, and therefore you need to actually introduce new technology as you go on.
In our intro, we mentioned that Namibia imports a lot of its energy from neighboring countries. If it were to happen that these countries felt that we need more energy for ourselves as opposed to exporting this, what happens then for us? Can you confidently say that we'll be able to sustain ourselves without the imports of electricity from other parts of the continent?
I think let's go to how much are we importing, for example. I have said that we have got the installed capacity of 600 versus the 620 demand. But unfortunately, because of the source of that installed capacity, for example, if you add more wind or you add more solar, of the 600 megawatts that is the installed capacity, about 20% of that come from solar and wind. Mm-hmm. But it so happens then that the wind and the solar is not always available at every time. So as I said, you might have a solar plant of 20 megawatts, but in the evening it can't give you what you need. You're going to have to get that power from somewhere else. You have got a wind that does not always blow at the same time and at the same revolution. Mm-hmm. And therefore you're going to need to get that power from somewhere else. So, and equally the hydro that we have got in Rokhana, unfortunately that depends on whether we got enough water in the rivers. If there's not enough water in the river, yes, you have got installed capacity, but it can only give you half of what you actually, it can give you. So because of that, even with the 600 that we have got, unfortunately, occasionally, up to 60% sometimes need to be imported. Simply because the river is not flowing to the maximum. Mm-hmm. The solar isn't always available. And therefore, it's very, very important also for us to make sure that as we go forward, what does a mix look like really? What is that mix of generations? Yeah. You can't continue to add more, for example, of the solar, unless the battery technology actually improve, such that you can actually store electricity coming from solar. But as long as you don't have that, unfortunately, you can only rely on solar during the day. So, for example, in 2019, we had to import about 65% of our energy.
That's a lot.
It's a lot. And then that will cost about 3.4 billion Namibian dollars. And that's actually when people say, well, we are exporting capital to the extent, to that extent, as opposed to us installing more capacity. And I would agree to say I don't think it's sustainable for us to continue to import that much, but that can only then happen if we somehow then have to change the mix and therefore not to rely on sources that are not always available. Mm. Now, those sources that are always normally available, for example, if you had diesel, for example, if you're going to get your power from diesel or you're going to get it from coal, that is something that will run all the time and it give you the power. Yeah. But unfortunately, we don't all have that source. We don't have coal. We don't have the diesel necessarily. Yes, you can build a coal power plant, which can give you electricity all the time. But you also know that now there are people to say, look, the world have changed and we can no longer actually continue to get, to do electricity from coal. What they call dirty electricity, because it comes from coal that is going to, it's not good for the environment. Yes. And probably also going to be much more expensive than the solar. So there are a lot of complexity involved. But yes, I think our aim is still to continue to make sure at least that we close that gap where the installed capacity somehow can reliably give us all the energy throughout the time when you need the energy, and not only certain times. But SSI is very difficult because you cannot control the water in the rivers, unfortunately.
Namibia is very rich in uranium, and one would think, well, we have this very important mineral that other countries are mining and taking to their countries for nuclear energy purposes. Have we entertained the idea of perhaps having a nuclear plant someday in Namibia, since we have the uranium in abundance? Or what exactly is the situation on the ground in regards to that?
Resource development plan, the 20-year plan I talked about earlier, there is a mention that we should investigate the viability of us embracing nuclear power. And that is something that we are doing. But one thing is it's not necessarily true to say simply because you are a uranium-producing country, and therefore it follows that you are going to, or nuclear power will be the right source. It's not. It doesn't follow that way. Number one, we just like all the other commodities that we mine, it's not that you're gonna get that free. You're gonna have to buy that uranium. You're gonna have to have somebody to process it for you, and therefore we should not always just think that because we have it in our country and therefore it should be. But obviously, if we were to go that route, it's much easier because you got the source. Yes. To source it and to buy it from those who are mining, it will be possible for you to do that. But we also have to look at the what we have so far. What we have learned is that for you to have a feasible nuclear plant, in our case, based on our demand, you need to have a minimum plant which can give you 400 megawatts of nuclear. Otherwise, if it's less than that, really it's become very not viable at all. Now, you had to wait to say, now, if we are going to have a nuclear plant of 400 megawatts, what do you do with the other source? Do you discard them, or and therefore you're only going to rely on that? So there are a lot of permutation, I think, involved in discussing that. But as I say, it's really a good idea that we should discuss it and really discover to say, well, if it turns out that this is really the right way to go, well, we throw that in the mix. And therefore, we intend actually to have that debate, and not only internally, we are doing that internally, but we should actually have that debate, publicly, so at least we can say, well, these are the informations, and if we were to go to that route, that's what we need to do, and then see how far we get.
This is joining us, you're watching Geoenergy. We'll be back after this short commercial break. Welcome back. Mr. Minister, there have been complaints that the REDs, or the rural electricity distributors, have made electricity more expensive for consumers. What value are the REDs adding to, as far as electrification is concerned in the country? And perhaps let's start with, who are the REDs exactly? Who owns these entities?
As you know, the REDs stands for Regional Electricity Distributors. And these are entities that were created some time back. It's probably about 10 years or so ago now. You had certain local authorities that are now where they distribute electricity to their consumers, to their residents in towns. And there was a time when there were a number of those, especially the small towns, town council or village councils. They were not in a position actually to distribute electricity. Either they did not have the skills, the personnel who can do that. They didn't have engineers, nor did they have the infrastructure, the hard infrastructure to distribute electricity. Yes. And therefore, they're forever failing to distribute electricity. And there was an outcry to say, every time people their power is off, and therefore what to do. And I think the solution was then to say, why don't we create a system whereby a number of local councils or village councils or town councils get together and they form one company that will then be responsible for distributing electricity to the residents. And that was the idea of having REDs, to say, because we have got this small town council without enough capacity to distribute electricity to the consumers, the solution was then, so let's have a much larger company then that will take over the function of distributing electricity. The decision was then to say each region will then have that kind of a setup. where the shareholder of that companies are the local councils. For example, if you take Erongo Red, the shareholders will be vouched by, town council, Swakopmund, Arandis, and all the towns in Erongo. So is Nored, so is Senored. There was an attempt also to have a red in the south, but unfortunately that did not happen. They are still in the process of establishing that red. In the central, which is now where we are in Venda, for example, there's still no red, and they are still an attempt to try and establish that. So that's the history about the red. To try to stabilize the supply of electricity and how to manage it. Now, it's like with everything else, there are always downsides to you do that, but there's you have to weigh the cost and benefit of whatever decision you are making. Now, I know that there has been a concern that with the red, establishing of a red, we might have simply just increased the cost. Although the idea was for you to resolve the problem of non-ability to distribute electricity to consumers, but you might also have inadvertently, probably, have created a situation where it will become more expensive. There was a study made about 7 years ago that came out to suggest that the concern of power being more expensive because they are going through the rates is not really borne out. Maybe marginally so, but the benefit of now people not having power cuts all the time, that might outweigh that marginal cost that might have increased on the rates. So that's really how it came about. Now, if you ask me, for example, now why don't we have the rates established in the south, for example, as I say, it's not established just yet. Why don't we have one, in the Commerce region, for example? In the south, I think we do not have sufficient town councils who are prepared actually to form a RED, because as I say, the RED is formed by the town councils, and so far the system does not necessarily force any town council to say you shall be one of these, you shall form a RED. The idea was really to say people must see the value in creating this RED. And if you got 3 town councils to say, well, we will be saved better if we have this RED, of course, will then facilitate the formation of a RED. The Ministry of Mines and Energy, together with the Ministry of Urban, because the town council, though, resort under the Ministry of Urban, will then assist them that they form such a RED. So there are still discussion how the best way to form the RED in the south. The same thing, there's a discussion how to form the RED in Commerce region. The discussion, I think, with the Commerce region, it's probably more involved because, as you were mentioning about the cost, there's a concern that, Windhoek CD, being a very huge distributor of electricity, they don't want to believe that they don't have the capacity, and therefore the reason of them forming a RED to resolve the issue of capacity, they don't think that's really an issue they have got. Yes, I mean the smaller ones might have that problem, and therefore we need to find a better reason why we need to have a RED, and that discussion is ongoing. But as I said, it's usually not usually, it's the town council that get together, they agree to say this is how we are going to form this, we are the shareholder in this, and then the RED is formed. On top of the town councils being the shareholder in the REDs, you also have the regional council who are part of the REDs. In all the RED that are formed now, the regional councils are also shareholder in that RED.
Mr. Minister, the current policy of REDs is that if you are not within 500 meters of a transformer, then you need to get a transformer which costs over 100,000 Namibian dollars. In your opinion, is this practical for rural inhabitants, and does it perhaps also defeat the purpose of having established REDs if people can't afford having access to these transformers.
Yeah. But the issue of transformers probably is different from the argument to be made whether you need to have rates or not to have no rates. Because, as I say, the rates were established because there was a need to say, to make it more efficient to supply the electricity. Now, it so happened then that most of the rates probably will have their customers in rural areas. The rates, if you are in a wrong rate, probably, the way you operate is not probably the same, environment than when you are no-rate way. Most of your customers are probably in rural areas.
Yes.
So when it comes to then the transformers, as you say, when you are going to take electricity from the main grid, obviously you're going to need to have a transformer. And the policy, the way it works, is not necessarily a policy of the rate. That's really a policy of government through NAMPower. Mind you, all those already actually they're buying their power from NAMPower. They don't have their own generations. Although now they're of course starting now, as I was saying earlier, with IPPs.
Yes.
You can have an IPP that can generate directly for NORAD or SENORAD or whatever already it is. But right now, most of they are still taking from NAMPower, and that policy of the transformer is not really the rates transformer. It's really government policy through NAMPower. It's simply meaning that if you're going to have a if you're going to have to tap power from the main grid, you need to have a transformer to modulate the electricity that must come from the main grid. Now, that transformer generally can only cater for a certain distance. It cannot go beyond a certain distance, and that distance was then calculated to be a 500 meter for you to be able to have stable supply of electricity. If you extend far too long, it will be not a stable generation or distribution. It will be on and off, and therefore you're not actually saving anybody. And that's why the transformer can only cover that radius of 500. And therefore, the idea was then to say anybody then within that radius can then tap into that electricity. Yes, it costs a lot of money, but the system also says if I'm the one who buys the electricity or the transformer first, I might then be required to pay that much. But every time people then joined the grid because of that transformer, I get refunded from NAMPower because then there are more and more people joining because of the transformer. So in the end, it will not be 100,000. It will be then a cost that is distributed among everybody who have connected because of the transformer. That was the whole idea about the policy, to say, yes, the cost might be too high initially, but as many people then join, then the cost will be shared for between everybody who have joined particular locality where the transformer is.
Can you tell us, are there any incentives from the ministry to in assisting the rural population who want to be connected to the grid? Yeah,
we do have some incentives. For example, we do have the what we call the National Energy Fund. This National Energy Fund is a fund that is managed by the Ministry of Mines and Energy, where people can apply for a interest-free loan. So you get a loan for you to then connect to electricity. And as I said, the incentive is like, it's interest rate free. You don't have to pay interest. And I think also the criteria for you to really access that is really not as stringent as like you can get from a bank. So that is one way then trying to say, we provide the access, and people must then also then be assisted to be able to tap into that electricity.
How successful has this fund been in terms of doing that?
I think it's been successful. Usually we budget a certain amount for that, but as you understand, that budget is always much less than what the demand is. But I think on average you have about up to 20, 25 people who would then actually be helped with that loan, and then so it goes. It's not an unlimited budget because we fund that fund through a levy on the electricity. Now, you also don't want to put too much levy on that for you to do that, because you're going to make it more difficult or make it more expensive. But really, certainly, I think it's an incentive, I think, for people to be able then to connect to the grid or the mini grid.
And are people paying back without a lot of problems being encountered along the way?
I think so far people are paying back. But as with everything, there are always those who, like, sometimes there's this idea, but it's because it's a government loan, it's like I don't have to pay it back. But unfortunately, when you do that way, you just make it more difficult for other people to benefit from the same fund as well. But I think on average, people are paying back their loan, yes.
Right, that's good. There are many cases where some individuals refuse power cables or poles or whatever infrastructure that allows for the distribution of electricity to be put up in their fields, especially in the rural areas, and it often leads to disputes. Can you explain a little more on the policy that guides this, and what are perhaps the major issues when it comes to disputes? Is not people not being remunerated enough money, or what exactly is the issue here?
I have not personally received complaint that was the case, that you have people who are refusing to have lines going across their private property. I haven't. But yes, the policy is that whoever is going to then, construct those lines across somebody's private property, you're going to have to negotiate with the owner of the property. Whether now is when is done by the ministry itself, or when it's done by a RED or by Nampower, the policy is so that you negotiate with the owner of the land, and then whatever then the solution is, then whatever compensation. There's no like to say it shall be this. It's really by negotiation. But as I said, I have not really have heard dispute that way could not be resolved. By and large, I think those negotiations were resolved. Yes, maybe it takes long. Because you're also going to case where people now feel like, oh, okay, now it's a chance for me to cash in, and therefore, it goes on and on and on. But I have not really had that people having a serious problem where it hampering the progress of whatever it is you are doing. But as I said, that's now whether it's the ministry doing that or Nampower or the REDs, because as you would understand, the rural electrification is not only done by the ministry directly. Nampower also have got their own program, and the rest also have got their programs. But what we try to do is to make sure that we collaborate, so you do not duplicate efforts throughout the regions. But if we concentrate on this particular region, then Nampower will then do something somewhere else. So at least we can accelerate the rural electrifications.
Lastly, before we go for a break, compensation also, it all depends on how good your negotiation skills are. I mean, if I have a piece of land and I have a bit of education, I'm in a much more better position to get more than I think I deserve for you passing through my property, as opposed to, let's say, a subsistence farmer who does very little or no schooling at all. How do we ensure that people are fairly compensated for the infrastructure passing through their land? But
Jonas, let's also think about that. The way you put it is almost like somehow, because I got this line crossing my field, something is taken away from me. There's nothing taken away from you.
So no trees are chopped down?
There's nothing being chopped down. There's nothing, And normally what really happens is just like, in the rural areas, people might have their fences around their fields. Yeah. We will normally make sure that there's a gate that goes, it's a proper gate to go in and out for, people need to prepare that line. That's going to really go, you lose nothing. In fact, chances are you are going to gain, because mostly, when it goes across those fields, people do get electricity out of it. So it should not really be seen like it's an opportunity now for people to say, we need a compensation. It's not like where, for example, where we are establishing a new town and therefore we need to take the land, and therefore we must be compensated. The land is not taken away, nor is it made any lesser usable than it was before. It's a pole here and another pole there, and the line just go across, and therefore. But the issue was just to say, you should really be able to have access and such that you do not now just make it difficult for people to go through. If I need to repair the line, but for that I put a proper gate in and out, and that's really what it is.
This is joining us. You're watching Geoenergy. We'll be back after this short commercial break. Welcome back. If you're just joining us, you're watching Geoenergy, and today we're discussing electrification in Namibia and the status of energy in Namibia as a whole. Mr. Minister, can you reflect on the policy which will allow independent power producers to enter the sector? There are people who feel that the sector is not really receiving receiving the necessary support that it needs to allow these individuals that would like to produce their own energy. What do you have to say about that?
Okay. Yes, I can. I can. Very, very, very interesting discussion, because as you know, historically, electricity was always provided by the state.
Yes.
Through, in our case, through NAMPower. And one of the reasons why that was done is simply to say, the importance of electricity, and therefore the idea was like to really just leave that to the private sector, to do the one to actually sell electricity. It wasn't, people weren't quite comfortable, because this is really something, as I say, people need to have. And therefore, if you're really subject to supplying that only because, people who are actually doing business with that, maybe it wasn't. Mm-hmm. But I think with time, and with more and more people have access to electricity, I think there was also an understanding, look, but why is it really true that it's only the government who can, generate electricity? Yeah. Is it not possible, like other countries where you also got the private sector who are also then investing in generation of electricity? Especially in a case where maybe the government cannot always have the resource to put up plants that can then generate electricity that are needed. So I think over sometimes now, maybe the last 3 or 4 years, we've been talking about to say, look, maybe we need to change the system whereby you can also allow private sector investors to invest in electricity generations. Mm-hmm. And I think about 5 years ago, the ministry then did have a policy where they allowed private investors to generate electricity as long as the plant was 5 megawatt and below, what they call to call it a refit, mm-hmm. Whereby you actually generate electricity and then you sell that to NAMPower. And that was really like a kind of a trial to see whether it will really be possible to have private investors to generate electricity. And I think after that trial period, it was found that it's actually quite feasible. Number one, there are people who were actually interested to invest in the sector. And also the tariff that they were able to generate, it was not really far away from the tariff NAMPower was able to actually to generate. Yeah. So the affordability part and also the ability for them actually to generate that, it was actually proven that yes, it can happen. And after that trial period of having the refit system, it was then opened up to say, I think let's allow IPPs to invest as long as their tariff, in other words, the price at which consumer eventually will have to buy the electricity, is really reasonable. Because again, it's one thing to allow people to invest in this, but as I said, because of how electricity is needed by everybody else, the price is really regulated by the ECB, and therefore we don't want people then to sell electricity to much higher price, such a way that now the affordability becomes very, very difficult. So as we have now, we do allow IPPs to invest, and as I did say, of the 600 megawatt, for example, that we are now actually have installed. Mm-hmm. About 20% of that actually come from IPPs. So, and 5 years ago or so, I mean, probably 99% was only NAMPower. So
with time, that is increasing. So it's very, very, I think, important introduction of IPP into the system to make sure that it's not only the state that is doing that. But also coupled to that is the fact that people say, well, it's one thing to say now you have opened up where investors can also generate electricity. But why is it then that the case that still is only Nampower that can buy up the electricity? And that was actually the arrangement that Nampower would buy up that electricity. But we have also changed that and modified that such that IPPs now, they are also allowed to be able to identify their own customers other than Nampower and sell directly to those customers. And those are the customers that we call the system the modified single buyer, which means we had a single buyer that was only Nampower, which means all the IPPs had to sell their electricity to Nampower. And that's why this was called a single buyer. But now we have now modified that system whereby up to 30% of large consumers can be supplied through IPPs directly from an IPP. You don't have to have a power purchase agreement with Nampower. You can simply go to a mining company or a municipality and say, I want to supply 30% of your need, and this is my plan, and you supply directly to the consumer.
And how is that the price regulated?
Yeah, the price is regulated whether you are now Nampower as a generator or you're an IPP. The price is regulated by the ECB. The ECB always do an annual review of the tariffs. And therefore, then all the IPPs that are going to invest in electricity generations, they have then to be within their tariffs. If you are already outside the tariff because of your cost, the way you manage your business, and therefore your cost is going to generate a much too high tariff, the ECB may not consider to give you a generation license because you still need to have a generation license. And therefore, if you are really an outlier, that the ECB might say, well, yes, you might have the technical ability to actually generate electricity, but your price is simply much too high for the consumer, and therefore we may not actually give that license.
And talking about the consumer, there are people who feel that electricity in Namibia is pretty expensive. Where do you strike the balance in terms of crafting policy to say, well, you must understand that this is how electricity ends up to your light switch or to your plug or whatever it may be. I think people do not understand that process. How exactly does it work? And to come say, okay, now this is how much we'll charge per kilowatt per hour. Because there are people who feel that, because on one hand, you want to provide electricity for everyone. But at the same time, you also need to get something out of it. Where do you strike the balance?
That's why electricity, actually the price is still controlled. It's not like anybody can just charge whatever they want to charge. But the point will still be the fact that to generate electricity, it costs money. And whether it is Nampower or whether it's an IPP, they need to recover their cost of generation. And therefore, that's why now when you regulate the price, we then look at the cost structure of those generators, whether it's now the IPP or Nampower, to say your cost structure seems too high. Chances are then the price of electricity is going to be too high, and therefore look at your cost. So the unfortunate thing will always be unfortunate. We might be able to generate electricity, but how many people can really afford that electricity that's being generated? And I think that's the challenge we have when we understand and we agree that everybody needs to have access to electricity, and therefore we're trying to actually accelerate the access to electricity. But you may find yourself also that you have access, which means you got your grid everywhere else, and people can actually have if they can afford it. But if they cannot afford it, the access doesn't mean anything really, because if I'm not able to actually afford the electricity, then unfortunately that doesn't mean much to me because I'll never have electricity. And therefore, it's very important, especially when it comes to electrification, for example, to say that electricity must go concomitant with us having some rural development, where people can have a livelihood and still be able then to afford that electricity. Because the idea is not that it will be given for free, because it costs something to generate it. And therefore, if we also do not pay attention to rural development, economic development in the rural areas where people are living, for them also to be able to make an income and be able then to spend a part of their income on electricity. So the two issues have to go hand in hand. Otherwise, you may find really we have got all this capacity installed, but people can't afford electricity. But at least on the affordability part, that's why we still have got the ECB looking at the tariff, and therefore you don't just generate electricity at any cost and then we take it, because we need to take care of the affordability of the people.
There's some informal settlements in the capital that do not have access to electricity, and this is the capital that we're talking about. We're talking about Windhoek. How much of a bigger challenge is it then, if somebody in Windhoek doesn't have access to electricity where they are residing? How much of a challenge is it if you look at the rural areas, and perhaps also touch on the electrification of rural areas? What are the criteria that these areas must meet for them to say, yes, okay, you guys really need electricity?
I think if you start with the electrification, like you talk about in towns like in Windhoek, you do have people who do not have access. Although they are part of the townland, they don't have access to electrifications. But that does not qualify for rural electrification. That is already electrification that's normally supplied by the town councils. But because of the lack of infrastructure that can actually extend electrification to the whole area in the town, that's why you find yourself certain area don't have electricities. And apart from that also, we also got a challenge where a municipality might have got the capacity actually to electrify. But then you have sometimes, unfortunately, where you have got people would go and settle in an area, which in terms of the municipality town planning, that was not actually like ready for development there, but you're going to have people who end up being there. And unfortunately, people will stay now in that area without having infrastructure such as water or electricity. But that normally is really part of the municipality infrastructure development. And not because there's no access. The access is normally there. It could well be just because they don't have, maybe at a particular time, the budget to actually extend electricity. But it's much easier than rural electrification. Because as I said, if you have got people who are congregated at a certain area, it's much easier actually to have as many people have electricity. But you have got a vast country in Namibia, as we know it is, and then you have got a village there, another village there, and then you have to extend the grid there. It's really very costly in such a way that it ends up not being affordable to the people who actually want to give electricity. And that is why when it comes to rural electrification, what we started doing is to say we want to make sure at least that in the rural areas, all the public buildings, schools and clinics and hospitals, we want to make sure that those are electrified. And we also said when we do that, we also ensure that the community around those public institutions will also have access to electrifications. So at least you make it a bit affordable because you got the public institution and therefore the rural area and around it. Otherwise, it's really becoming difficult for you to to extend the grid throughout the countries.
Yeah.
And we are now starting to think about alternative methods of doing that. Maybe to have some mini grids. Maybe you can have each region can have its own mini grids, so at least it's cost effective rather than trying to extend the main grid everywhere else. So those are some of the things we are thinking about to say, how do we ensure that we still continue to electrify the rural areas at a minimal cost, other than through the normal grid that is much more expensive than having smaller grids, you know, for each region.
Lastly, do you think there's a connection between people migrating to more urban areas because obviously there's access to more opportunities in terms of jobs and businesses and whatever the case may be? But do you think that if the electrification can be sped up, can we see people seeing a reason to stay and say, no, I don't need to go. If I'm a barber and I'm based in a village, I have electricity, I can put up my little barber shop here and you know, make a living for myself. Do you think there's a connection between the lack of electricity in some parts of the country and them being coerced to move to more urbanized areas where they have access to electricity and better opportunities?
Partly there's probably a reason, yes. I mean, urbanization, you know, takes place all over the world. It's not only in Namibia where we see people mostly wanting to go to towns because they perceive that you will be better off to send your kids to school or to have a hospital, you know, whatever it is people think, you know, is necessary in the modern living. So you are better off if you live in a town, and therefore urbanization, I think, will continue. And we have countries, you know, where they have got rural electrifications, but people still want to go to the towns. So I'm not so sure whether necessarily if you got rural electrification in everywhere else, people will stop coming to the towns. What will probably stop that is like, I mean, the allure of town, you know, being where people want to go.
Yeah.
I'm not so sure that can be stopped by electrification, but certainly I'm not saying it's not important. It's very important. That's why I'm saying if we are continuing to do rural electrifications without concomitantly also looking at the rural economic development, it will not work, because then it will be, you will have access, but people cannot afford it because I don't have any means to do that. And therefore, yes, rural electrification is needed for us to have also economic development in the rural areas. But I don't think we can use that as an effective tool to stem urbanization. I think urbanization will continue, and therefore the only solution is really we have to be ready, I think, with infrastructure that can accommodate everybody whom we know they will want to come to the towns. So we're going to have to do both, unfortunately.
Right. Honourable Minister, it's been a great pleasure talking to you, and we'll be talking soon again.
Thank you very much.
And that was Tom Alwendo, the Minister of Mines and Energy, giving us an in-depth understanding of the status of electrification in the country. If you have any questions or want to find out more about how you can get involved, you can contact the PRO of the Ministry at info@mme.gov.na. Alternatively, you can check out their Facebook page, the Ministry of Mines and Energy, or visit their website at mme.gov.na. And with that said, we've come to the end of the show. Till next time, it's cheers for now.